Here we go, folks. Here I am, back again after another hour of really, really good Torah. Amazing what's been happening here. And we have been cruising along, and we got people joining right now every minute, every hour. Some people cruise in, some people cruise out, which is really appropriate, just as we expected. And here's Rabbi Shapiro, is all ready to go. Looks like he's all queued up. So before we get to Rabbi Shapiro, I'm going to do a few thank yous, and then I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Shapiro. So first of all, thank you to Rabbi Horowitz for a fantastic class, wonderful hour. Before Rabbi Horowitz, we had an opportunity to hear from Moradina today. And that was a lot of fun. Rabbi Neuberger taught a Daf Yomi. Rabbi Kashkaraman answered questions, particular halachic questions about the COVID virus. Rabbi Zellman explained why Shavuos is on the 6th or the 7th day of Sivan. Rabbi Foxbrenner gave a beautiful class about receiving the Torah. Rabbi Meir Cohen gave a class about V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. And I want you to know that this morning, Rabbi Dickstein came in at 4 a.m. and started teaching, and he had people learning with him. When I came in at 6 a.m. to take over from him, he had 9 people learning with him. So that was absolutely fantastic. It was really, really beautiful that so many people are coming out to learn Torah. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank all the participants. So there's 3 mitzvahs that we're doing here by participating. One of them is you're learning Torah. So you come to learn Torah, it's great. Extra Torah that's learned from all these wonderful teachers. If it wasn't for all those wonderful teachers, this program would not exist. It wouldn't mean anything. So it's all about the teachers. But of course, there's a second mitzvah, all those teachers wouldn't teach unless there are people there to teach too. So you are not only learning the Torah, but you're enabling the Torah. Because you come and because you listen, you're making it happen. So that's mitzvah number 2. And of course, mitzvah number 3 is if you take a moment as you came through the Raise Giving website, ariel.raisegiving.com. So if you take a moment to donate a little something, it's very, very greatly appreciated. You're perpetuating all the Torah that we're disseminating throughout the year, doing programs like this, and doing many, many others. And I have to say, I want to plug this particular program because many programs, you can go to events and dinners and banquets and carnivals. We've done all of those at Ariel. All the shuls do, we do it too. But I know firsthand from having put on all those events carry with them a price tag. They have overhead. In order to do the event, you have to spend some money. This particular event has a very, very minimal price tag. So I would have to say that, I can't say for exactly, but at least 95 cents on your dollar is going straight to tzedakah. And we could have done an annual banquet or some other things like that, but we thought, let's do what we do, which is teach Torah, and let it be all about the Torah. And if people want to support it and give money, then that's wonderful. They'll get, because we're giving them something, not just extracting money or giving you dinner, but you'll get something, which is all this wonderful Torah from all these great rabbis and rebbitzins, and then in return, you'll support more Torah. So it's a beautiful win-win situation all the way around. I want to mention some of our sponsors as we do each hour. I want to be sure to bring up our sponsors. And want to get the most up-to-date list because it's changing all the time. So as of 5:30, let's see, when do I have my latest updates? Oh, maybe I don't have an updated sponsor list since about noon, but people have been coming in all day. And let's see what we got here, because we want to thank all the people who've been sponsors of this wonderful event. And here they go. Yeah, beautiful. Okay, so first of all, we have Rabbi Yosef Shapiro coming up, and Rabbi Yosef Shapiro is going to be speaking in just a minute. I want to thank Barry Ritz for sponsoring this event, sponsoring Rabbi Shapiro, bringing him to us and enabling him to teach Torah here. So Rabbi Shapiro is a member of the Atlanta Scholars Kollel. Rabbi Shapiro is also establishing a new congregation Torah Center in Brookhaven, and we're a dynamic young teacher in Atlanta, so we're really happy to have him here as part of our roster. So one of the things I'm going to do right now, first thing I'm going to do is make Rabbi Shapiro a co-host, and I'm going to encourage all of you, thank all of you who've supported already. I'm going to ask you to please take another moment and to support this endeavor by just clicking on donate and giving anything you can at the website. Two ways that you've come to see this event. You maybe came in, and as soon as you came in, you saw a poster that said 48 hours Torathon. That was designed by Rabbi Michal Friedman, who's a great graphic artist, and we're really, really happy to have him as a member of our congregation, and also as a teacher. He's going to be teaching tomorrow. I think it's at 4 o'clock, so tomorrow. So we're really happy, and thank you, Rabbi Friedman, for that. The people at Raise Giving have the website up that we're using, and I also want to thank a fellow named Josh Needle, and Josh Needle has been doing a lot of technical assistance for us, and he can be reached at a place called Broad Spectrum Services LLC.com. So Josh is a good guy, and he's really kept us up and running. When you come in, you click on the play button. If you click on the play button, you're watching this live streamed, which is wonderful. Glad to have you on live streaming, but you can't participate. So if you would like to participate, if you'd like to ask a question, say something, or find out, interact with one of these wonderful teachers, then you have to click on Be an Active Participant button. And when you're an active participant button, although we are going to mute all of the active participants, but you can unmute as you would like, and you can unmute and just speak up and share whatever you have to say. And I'm sure Rabbi Shapiro would love to hear from you. So thank you all for your support, and thank you all for everyone who's supported this in so many different ways, not just in monetary ways, but who've supported in so many different ways. And without further ado, I'm going to spotlight Rabbi Yosef Shapiro. And once Rabbi Yosef Shapiro is spotlighted, he is the man, and he's going to take it away from there. There you go.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Friedman. In previous years, I've actually spent Shavuos in Ariel, so it's nice to be able to participate even if I'm not there in person. So I want to begin with a question, so I hope everyone's going to take advantage of unmuting themselves. When God gave the Torah to Moses, what did Moses receive from him? What do you guys think? Did he get 10 commandments? Did he get more commandments, less commandments? Uh-oh, nobody thought about this. Okay, so let's try each approach. So if he only received the 10 commandments, then I'm going to ask a follow-up question. And that is, does anyone know why we eat dairy on Shavuos? Anyone know why we eat dairy specifically on Shavuos? Okay, so there are a few answers given. One of the answers is that the Jewish people, prior to receiving the 10 commandments, or prior to receiving the Torah, they had been able to eat meat without any problems. They had no laws of kosher, so they could just find a cow, cut it open, and start eating the meat. But then God gives the Jewish people the Torah. And the Torah has very complicated rules. Some of the rules are about how to slaughter the animal, which takes a certain amount of time to prepare the animal for the proper slaughtering. Some of the commandments have to do with how long you leave the meat soaking in salt so that the blood can be removed. And therefore, practically, when they came down from Mount Sinai, it was impossible for them to have any meat, because the process now that they had just learned was a process that would involve more time, because now they need at a minimum 3 days of salting their meat. Therefore, when they came down from Mount Sinai, the only thing they could eat was dairy. And that is one of the reasons brought down why the Jewish people eat dairy still today on the holiday of Shavuot. Now, the interesting thing about that is that when God gave Moshe the Torah and he gave him the 10 Commandments, none of the 10 Commandments talk about the laws of kosher. So what is the opinion? How could we be saying that they had to eat dairy because they just received the laws of kosher? If all Moses received was the 10 Commandments, then he's never heard about any rules of kosher. So how could they come down and have to eat dairy unless God gave them the commandments of kosher? Which means that we have to acknowledge that when God gave Moses the 10 Commandments, he has to have given them more than just those 10. So there are many different opinions about what was given. Some opinions are that he gave them the entire Torah. The problem with that, and very, very prominent authorities have asked this question, is that some commandments are dependent on certain acts. So, for example, does anyone know where we learn the rules of inheritance from? Rabbi Friedman, are we sure that that they can unmute themselves?
I think they can unmute themselves.
Okay.
But I will tell you something. It just so happens that I have a Gemara open in front of me, and it's open to Daf Kuf Tes Zion in Baba Basra, and the Mishnah that I'm looking at says that the daughters of Slavkat took 3 portions of the land of Israel. So
Excellent. I'm glad Rabbi Friedman knows how to unmute. So that is where we learn inheritance from. As Rabbi Friedman just quoted the Mishnah, we learn the laws of inheritance from the daughters of Slavkat. Slavkat had passed away, and he had only daughters. He had no sons. And the daughters of Slavkat came to Moshe, and they said, we want a portion in the land of Israel as well. And Moshe went to God and had a discussion with God about how the rules should, I'm just letting someone in, about how the rules of inheritance should work. And therefore, we learn the rules of inheritance from that conversation. So a lot of commentaries ask that if we are to believe that God gave Moshe the entire Torah, so then what is going on with the laws of inheritance? That only happened because of a story that Slavkat had later on. So there are different opinions about that. But for now, let's ask another question. We're working now with the opinion that it has to be that Moses received more than just the 10 Commandments. And our proof was that the commentaries tell us they couldn't eat meat anymore because they had the laws of kosher. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, if it's true that God gave them all of the commandments, or at least more than just the 10 Commandments, what is so special about the 10 Commandments? Why are those singled out? Why didn't God have the 613 commandments? Or 10 commandments, maybe it's a good number, and have a different 10. What is so unique about these 10? So there are 2 main opinions given about this. One opinion is that if you look at the tablets are broken down into 2 groupings of 5. The first grouping of 5 are the following 5. Number 1, believe in God. Number 2, don't believe in anything else, no idolatry. Number 3, don't say God's name in vain. Number 4, honor one's parents. Number 5, keep the Shabbat. That's column number 1. Column number 2 is do not murder, do not kidnap, do not commit adultery, do not testify falsely, and do not be jealous. So some of the commentaries say that the Torah wanted a system, or I'm sorry, not the Torah, God wanted a system where it could evenly break up the commandments into two of the main categories that the mitzvahs fall into. So some commandments that we have are commandments that are between us and our fellow Jew. How do we interact with each other? How do we handle business transactions with each other? And some of our commandments are between us and God. So the first 5 commandments on the tablets have to do with the interaction between us and God. The first one, believe in God. The second one, don't follow idolatry. Number 3, don't use God's name in vain. Number 4, keep the Shabbat. Obviously, a command God says he wants us to emulate him when he created the world. He created the world with 6 days of work and 1 day of rest. So we're supposed to emulate that as the perfect plan for efficiency. But what's puzzling is the next one. Or well, I actually did out of order. But puzzling is the last of the 5 in the first column. And that is the commandment to honor one's parents. Because intuitively, one would think, well, if I'm honoring my parents are other people. So if there's a commandment to honor them, I would think that is a commandment that is an interaction between myself and other people. So why did God put that commandment on the side of the commandments that interact with ourselves and God? Does anyone have any thoughts about that? Okay, I'll ask.
You need to call on somebody.
I'm nervous that they're not even there. I'll ask another fundamental question, which I think everyone should have thought about at some point in their life. If you haven't, I think you'll find it a very important question. And that is that if you look at different species in the world, some species reproduce without parents. So some species reproduce spontaneously. And in fact, if you look at the first 2 people in the world, they were created without parents. Yet we know that nowadays, a person needs parents in order to be born, in order to be brought into this world. And the question is, if God had a reason for everything he did, why did God make it a system where we have parents? Why couldn't God create the world where everyone developed spontaneously, and then we wouldn't need parents? Has anyone ever thought about that? Anyone have any thoughts about that? Why God made the world in a way that we have parents?
I think it's to have an appreciation for understanding God as our ultimate parent, but we can't interact with him directly. So we learn a lot of lessons from our parents in order to understand how we can relate to him, and more importantly, how he relates to us, which is especially true when if we're blessed to have children and become parents ourselves, then we can look at it from his perspective. But prior to that, we can look at it from just understanding the role of a parent.
Excellent. So the Jewish philosophers explain, like Steve just mentioned, that God wants us ultimately to be able to have a relationship with him. And when we come to that relationship, we're supposed to be in such awe of God because of everything he gives us. So we're supposed to be overflowing with appreciation for the one who gives us everything. But if we had no parents, we wouldn't be able to understand what it means to relate to someone who's given us so much more than we give to them. So God says, you know what? I'm going to create you in a world where you are going to be completely reliant on 2 individuals, your parents. And through your relationship with them, you'll come to understand what it means to appreciate that someone or 2 people are giving you every single thing you need. And through that, hopefully you can begin to understand what it means to appreciate myself, God, and everything that I do for you. I see we have a chat from Eric Merleson, which is the other idea, which is that if we wouldn't have a system in place for the transmission of knowledge, then it would be much more complicated for us to know what is true and what isn't true. So that is another answer given, that God gave us parents so we can understand the idea of trusting and the idea of tradition. In fact, one of the main proofs brought down that the Torah is true is the fact that our parents tell us that. So not only is our religion faith-based in faith in God, but a lot of it is predicated on faith in our parents and our mentors for what they teach us. So that's excellent. So those are the two reasons why God has given us a system where we have parents. And that really answers our question, because that explains why God specifically made it that the commandment of honoring our parents falls under the category of a relationship between us and God. Excuse me, because in order to develop that relationship with God, we need that sense of appreciation from parents who give us everything. So that is why we have the first category, including the commandment of honoring our parents. The second category are the mitzvahs that interact between us and other people. And that's why we have the laws of don't murder, don't kidnap, don't commit adultery, don't testify falsely, and don't be jealous. So that's one answer given. So God highlighted these 10 commandments because of the fact that it taught us a system that some of the commandments are for us to deal with our relationship with God, and some are for us to work on our relationship with other people. Another answer given is that through the 10 commandments, it actually encompasses all 613. And the way that works is as follows. When you look at the first two commandments have to do with our mind, our thought process. What do we believe in? So those two represent all of the commandments that have to do with our mind. The commandments that have to do with what we're supposed to think about and what we're not supposed to think about, how we think about things and how we don't think about things. Those are the first two commandments. The third commandment is the idea of not to say God's name in vain. That has to do with how we value things and how we prioritize things. If someone recognizes the value of God, you know you wouldn't dare say his name in vain. The fourth commandment is the commandment of honoring our parents, which we said is the idea of appreciation, being grateful for what we have. The fifth commandment is the keeping of Shabbat. That's the idea of appreciating that there are different times in the year for different things. So those are the laws of holidays and Rosh Chodesh and all the systems of time within our life. Do not murder has to do with how we interact with people as far as when things aren't going pleasantly. Do not kidnap, those two go together. Do not murder, do not kidnap go together. Do not commit adultery handles all the commandments that have to do with our relationships, whether it's with our spouse, parents, children, anyone else, coworkers, friends. Do not testify falsely has to do with our honesty. All the commandments that have to do with being honest, whether you're honest in business, honest with friends, honest with parents, honest with children. And number 10, do not be jealous, is understanding that everyone has their own unique mission in life and it can't be impacted by anyone else. And if a person internalizes that, then of course they know that there's no reason to be jealous about anything. Hold on one second, I just have to turn off my fan. I'm sorry, it might be easier to hear me now. So those are the two main answers given for what is significant about the commandments, the 10 commandments specifically. But we have to ask ourselves another question. So we determined that God gave many of the commandments, not just the 10 commandments. And he picked these 10 to give over to Moses on Mount Sinai in order for the Jewish people to recognize these two lessons we just spoke about, either the dichotomy between human interaction and God interaction, or the 10 that encompass 613. But the question is, and we have to ask ourselves this, is why did God have to give over any of them to Moses? If we understand that either way Moses had to go up to God to receive the rest of the commandments, why didn't God just give all of them to Moses? Why did God specifically want to give 10 commandments to Moses? What do you guys think? So there's an incredible medrash, and there's an incredible story that goes along with it. Has anyone, let me just pull up what it's called. Has anyone ever seen it's in the Galilee. Have Has anyone ever seen the mosaic in the Galilee, which is called the Mona Lisa of the Galilee? Has anyone ever seen this, the Mona Lisa of the Galilee? Okay, so apparently there's a mosaic of the Mona Lisa there. And when you look at her from 1,000 different angles, every angle you look at her, it looks like she's looking at you. And I'm going to read to you a medrash. Okay, this is a medrash from many, many years ago. The medrash says as follows. It says, this is Rabbi Yochanan talking. So Rabbi Yochanan is talking in his in the medrash, and he says as follows: Ha'ukinin hazos. I see this image. Elef b'nei adam mabitin ba. 1,000 people look at her. Kol echad v'echad mehem. Every single one of them, Omer says, Bi hi mivatech. She is looking at me. Kain HaKadosh Baruch Hu, similarly Hashem, Mabit b'chol echad v'echad, looked at every individual, v'omer lo anochi Hashem Elokecha, and said, the commandment, I am Hashem your God. Now, does anyone know where Rabbi Yochanan lived? It's brought down that Rabbi Yochanan lived in a city called Tzipori. And Tzipori, the Gemara, the Talmud tells us in Megillah, was located right near Tiberias in the Galilee. So there are many, many people who say that when Rabbi Yochanan wrote this medrash, he was referring to this image of the mosaic of the Mona Lisa. And he was saying, this is the image that everyone who looks at it from different angles, 1,000 people, they all are convinced she's looking at him. And this medrash explains why God gave us specifically 10 commandments, as opposed to just giving them all to Moses. Had God given them just to Moses, there would have been two things that would not have been accomplished. Number one, we would never have known about the physical manifestation of God in this world. The only time there was a revelation on a national level, so to say, where so many people saw God was at Mount Sinai. And what happened to the world? Famously, the Torah tells us that they heard lightning and they saw thunder, which obviously I think we all know that none of us has ever seen that or heard that. But it was clear that when God came into the world, the natural world we live in couldn't function the way it is. The manifestation of God's holiness was so vast that nature itself changed. And therefore, people were able to see thunder and hear lightning. So that's one lesson they needed to learn. The other lesson they needed to learn is what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. It's hard to imagine how there could be something, some entity. It's hard to imagine how there could be some entity that could look at every individual and provide every individual with exactly what they need, every challenge that they need to overcome, every good that they deserve. And how could that be? So God said, I'm going to come to you to give you the 10 commandments. And you're going to notice that every single one of you is going to think that I'm looking directly at you. And that's what the Medrash says. Until this day, you can go to that mosaic. I know this from a friend of mine who is a tour guide in Israel. You can go to that mosaic. You can look at the Mona Lisa of the Galilee, and you can see this image that appears to be looking at you from every angle that you stand. And that was really the message of what was going on. Okay, so before we go any further, I want to quickly recap some of the things we talked about, and then we'll go a little further. So we said it has to be that God gave more than just the 10 commandments on Mount Sinai, because otherwise, why were the Jews concerned with the laws of kosher, which is one of the reasons we eat dairy? We said it's difficult to imagine that God gave all of the commandments, though, because many of them are based on specific events happening later in the future. We also said that if God was giving more than just 10, why did he give those 10? And we talked about the two different answers, either that we wanted to separate the commandments that are between us and God as opposed to the ones between us and people, or the opinion that the 10 commandments encompass all 613 commandments. And then we said the reason why God specifically gave 10 to Moses as opposed to giving it all in heaven and us never interacting with God was for us to appreciate what it means to have a physical manifestation of God's presence in this world, and for us to understand how incredible it is that God can provide every person in this world with exactly what they need. Okay, so that's as far as the 613 commandments. But the next question we have to ask ourselves is that we know that there is a plethora of rabbinic commandments. So we don't only have the 613 commandments, we also have rabbinic commandments. We have some of them that are safeguards, that if we don't do something, it prevents us from doing further. For example, in the Torah, we're only forbidden to mix milk and beef. And the rabbi said, we're nervous that if you mix dairy and chicken, you may come to mix dairy and meat and beef. And therefore, the rabbis instituted a safeguard to prevent that. And they said you should not eat chicken with cheese either. That's one type of example. Another type of rabbinic example would be a takana, something that would provide benefit for the Jewish people. So all of these different ideas, all these rabbinic rules, the question is, when did God receive those? I'm sorry, when did God give those over? So there are two primary opinions that are brought down about this. One opinion, which is a fascinating idea, is that God actually gave every single idea over to Moses. So when Moses was with God for 40 days and 40 nights, God didn't just teach him the Torah, God taught him every single rabbinic rule. One opinion says, no way, that's not what happened. God really just gave him the biblical commandments. Because how could Moses know the rabbinic rules which are going to come up based on how different rabbis are viewing the community and their needs? Because we know rabbinic law could be instituted until the times of the Talmud. So this other opinion, I forgot who it is, it may be the Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol, the Smag, says that really he did not give Moses all the rabbinic laws. All he gave Moses was the rules necessary to translate to bring in the rabbinic laws. And therefore, although Moses didn't actually teach those laws, the system that is used was given to Moses. Okay, now, in Brookhaven, where my line of work is primarily, Brookhaven and Buckhead, one of the most common questions I get from people is, I think I understand why I should keep the biblical commandments, but why should I keep the rabbinic commandments? If God didn't give them to us, why is it binding that someone told me to do that? And it's a very, very, very important question. But the answer is that it's a mistake. God gave all of the rabbinic commandments. Either God actually taught them to Moses, or God said to Moses, these are the way you can expound upon the Torah, and get to the rabbinic rules. And therefore, really, God did give all the rabbinic rules. And that's why a person has to be careful not to think that they should only keep the biblical rules, because the rabbinic are also given by God. And also, there happens to also be a side reason that one of the biblical commandments is to listen to the rabbinic rules. So it happens to be that either way, the Torah God definitely mandates keeping the rabbinic rules. Now, what about the oral law? The oral Torah, the book of the Talmud. Do you guys think God gave that to Moses? So that, according to...
How would he have gotten it? I guess he would have to have.
So if you go through the Talmud, it seems like it's just discussions and stories. So it doesn't have to be from God. In fact, the conservative and reform movement will both tell you that is what it is. That the rabbis sat down, a bunch of rabbis sat down, and they were talking about some rules, and they saw some verses, and they talked about this, and they said this. So for example, the first tractate in the Talmud is Tractate Brachos. And the first Mishnah says, when can you begin saying Shema? At night. Okay, the first Mishnah talks about night. In the Jewish calendar, night comes before day. So the Mishnah says, when can you start saying Shema? And there are a few answers given. One says until Seis, which is when the stars come out. One is until midnight, and one is until the next morning. So you could say that there were just 3 rabbis who had a debate. Or it could be that God actually gave over the entire oral law. Now, if you say that, it would come out a fascinating thing. It would come out that well beyond the scope of what we can understand, God was able to create a system of laws that you could learn in future time all the thoughts that led to it. Meaning, when you have a Talmudic passage that's 5 pages long, and there's a conclusion of that passage. So that means that in the time of the Talmud, the rabbis were debating it, and they came out with that conclusion. Now, God, if we're going to assume God gave the oral law at Mount Sinai, that means that God already gave Moses that conclusion. And it comes out that God created a system where we were able to have a debate and discussion and always come out with the same conclusion that God had given Moses. Now, the commentaries explain that it has to be that God gave the oral law at Mount Sinai for several reasons. If you go through the Torah, several parts in the Torah cannot be understood without the oral law. The few famous ones that the commentaries discuss is number 1, what do we shake on Sukkot? What do we shake on Sukkot? The Torah tells us to shake a citrus fruit called an esrog. It doesn't tell us anything further. Without the oral law, God can't expect us to keep that. We would have no idea what to do. That's one example. Another example is the laws of slaughtering are not mentioned in the Torah. All the Torah says is you should shecht, Hebrew word shecht, shin chaf tes, an animal, and then it's kosher. It doesn't say how to do it, doesn't say who should do it, doesn't say anything about it. And yet the Torah tells us to do it. The oral law expounds upon all of these things. So it has to be that God gave over the oral law as well. And therefore it comes out that God gave Moses all of the conclusions. For example, God would say an esrog is the yellow citrus fruit that we are familiar with shaking on Sukkot. And even though that was given over, there's still an incredibly long, lengthy debate in Tractate Sukkot that comes to that conclusion, which is amazing if you think about how incredibly sophisticated God has to be, obviously well beyond the scope of anything we could imagine, that God was able to create a system of learning that would generate the same answer as a conclusion that was already drawn. And that's really what the Talmud is. The Talmud is really the analysis of different verses using a specific system that God gave to Moses to come to the conclusion about how to live our lives and understand the Torah in the way that God already taught Moses at Mount Sinai or in heaven at that time. Okay, so now we understand that God has given all those things, and therefore we can now begin to try to understand what it is that we are celebrating on Shavuot. So what is it that makes us unique as Jews? Any thoughts? So the only thing that really makes us unique is the fact that we have a specific set of commandments. Because everything else that we choose to do, a non-Jew could do just as easily. But what makes us unique is that we are commanded to do these things. And that's what the 613 commandments that we established were given on Mount Sinai, even though we only talk about the 10 commandments. We established that God gave far more to Moses. He gave him the 613 commandments. He gave him the oral law. He gave him the way to expound everything. And we celebrate on Shavuot the idea that that is what makes us unique. That is what makes us special. And in fact, one of the questions we have to ask is that it's brought down that we were not supposed to write down the oral law. So the oral law, the entire book of Talmud, which now obviously is written down, originally we were not supposed to write it down. Does anyone know why we were not supposed to write it down?
Because it was not the method of learning that the oral law was given to us for. It was meant to be a conversation in which you could engage your mind and think about the issues, not just read it.
So then why was it allowed? So 1 second. So then how does it work for us when we do have it written down?
Well, I mean, did you ask me why it was allowed first or not?
No. Why was it originally not written down? Meaning, whatever the reason is, I assume that it will not be countered by what we have, by when we eventually needed to write it down. But why originally did God not want it written down? Meaning God could have given us every single piece of the Talmud before any of those people were alive, and God could have either given just the conclusions, or God could have had every single thing there, and just instead of names, it would have just said, Amar, one person said to another person. And it'd all just be fake stories that God was using to teach us whatever analysis we're supposed to have.
Well, I mean, sorry if I said this already, but I think the point was to get us to like, dive into it and get into it, use our brain and like think about the halacha, not just to read it and then say, okay, that's the rule, I'm a robot, and then go home. It's to in other words, in order to like really study it,
So according to that, that was only really studied prior to when they wrote it down.
No, that doesn't suggest that. That just suggests that people might have taken the lazy way out if they were just given it in a written form. And I mean, I understand why we have it nowadays, because it was the fear that it was going to be lost during the persecution, and so they made a sacrifice, if you will, to write it down, because they felt there was no other way to preserve it. But that was never intended to be written down, I think, for the reason that questioning and answering is a very different way of learning than just reading a text.
Okay, it could be. It could be.
That's all I got.
That could be. That could be right. But in the introduction to the Smag brings a medrash. And the medrash is as follows: in the future, when Mashiach comes, God will ask, "Where are my children?" It says the non-Jews are going to bring the Torah that they translated and say, "Look, God, we the non-Jews are your children." God's going to turn to them. I'm reading the medrash word for word. God's going to turn to them and ask, what about the explanation for the mitzvahs that I taught Moses? And the non-Jews are going to have no answer. Then the Jews will bring the Sefer Torah that they have with the Talmud and show that they indeed know the messaging that God gave Moses at Sinai. Okay, the Smag then brings a verse to prove this, whatever it is there. So the point is that another thing we have to appreciate on that message that we're supposed to appreciate the idea that God gave us the Torah, which makes us unique, we have to recognize that it's not just the written Torah that makes us unique. And in fact, the medrash we just read says that the oral Torah is really what makes us unique. Because if you look at other religions, many of the other religions reference the, I'm sorry, people are in the waiting room and I didn't know to let them in. Hold on. So many religions reference the Old Testament and reference many things in the Torah, which would mean that the written Torah is not as unique to us. But very few people outside of Judaism study the Talmud. And that's really what this medrash is telling us in the Smag, that is what makes us so unique. So that's another thing we have to think about on Shavuot and appreciate that we have that uniqueness, appreciate we have that Torah. And in fact, a different reason given why we have dairy is because the only food that can ever sustain a person without any supplement is a baby that drinks milk. When a person's an adult and they want to have, let's say they're going to have just water, they'll only last a few days. If they just want to have bread, they'll only last a few days. But a newborn baby can live off of just milk for months. And the Torah is telling us, I'm sorry, not the Torah, the custom that we have dairy on Shavuot is teaching us that the same way dairy is the only food that can ever fully sustain something, similarly, the Torah is what completely sustains us. And that's really the message we're supposed to take from Shavuot. And I want to end with an incredible idea. I heard this idea probably about 10 years ago, and I share this every year on Shavuot. And for John Abrams, who I was learning with yesterday, this is the idea that I told you you'll have to wait till tonight to hear. The idea goes as follows. There's a rabbi in the Talmud, easy to remember his name. For me, his name is Rabbi Yosef. The Talmud says that Rabbi Yosef, every year, he treated Shavuot as his special holiday. And only for that holiday, he would call over his assistant, and he would say, I want you to go to the store, and I want you to get the greatest foods that exist. Go to the market, don't spare anything, get the greatest foods ever. Why? Because if not for Shavuot, there'd be 100 Yosefs in the world. But now that there's Shavuot, I can be recognized as Rabbi Yosef. Okay, nice Talmudic passage. The commentaries are bothered. Why is Rabbi Yosef the only one who seems to be worried about this? The Talmud doesn't quote anyone else as being so focused on making sure they have the best food, the best drinks for Shavuot. Yet really everyone should say the same thing. Any rabbi should say, if not for Shavuot, if not for the Torah, I'd be the same as everyone else. So they should really all be as grateful as Rabbi Yosef and be going all out for the holiday. So to answer that, there's a Talmudic passage in Tractate Ksubot, actually the first page. So Tractate Ksuvos, Daf Beis Amud Aleph, where the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Yosef, when he got older, he forgot everything he ever learned. And the idea that I heard, I think is a very profound idea, which I think is very important to internalize, is that very often in life, a person will pursue different endeavors, whether it's their career, whether it's their understanding of a certain extracurricular idea, whether it's a hobby. And if, God forbid, at the end of their life, they begin to lose their memory and they forget everything about that, it's as if it's gone. So, for example, if a person spent their life learning the skills of, I don't know, let's say analyzing stars, astrology, and they forget how to do it, so at that point when they're forgotten, the fact that they used to know how to do it is not a skill that's going to help them in life in any way at all. So therefore, Rabbi Yosef, when he told his assistant to get him special food, he was already at the point where he had forgotten all of his learning. And he's telling them an incredible idea. He's saying, if you look at me, you might say, you know what? You spent your whole life studying Torah. You don't study Torah anymore. You forgot it all. You are no better than anyone else. You're not Rabbi Yosef anymore. You're just plain old Yosef, the one who forgot all his learning. Rabbi Yosef says, no, that's not true. Because of Shavuot, because I had the Torah in my life, I'm a different person. And even though I forgot every single word I ever learned, it changed who I am. Because the Torah is not just an intellectual pursuit that's part of our lives. The Torah is something that changes who we are. It changes our thought process. It changes our relationships. It changes how we look at things. And it changes how we view everything in the world. So Rabbi Yosef said, Shavuot, I specifically have to give it extra honor because I am the person who people would say, he no longer has that skill. But because of Shavuot, because it's the Torah, it changed who I am. And I may have forgotten every single thing I ever learned, but I'm still Rabbi Yosef. I'm a different person than a person who would have lived until my life and had not studied the Torah, because the Torah changed who I am. And that's why he specifically, the rabbi who had forgotten all his learning, told his assistant to go all out for his Shavuot meal. And I think that's really a crucial lesson to internalize as we get ready for Shavuot, that we establish that on Shavuot, we have to appreciate how unique we are that we have these set of commandments. And we have to recognize that it's not an intellectual pursuit like we may view a different hobby. It's not that we study extra time in astrology and extra time in Torah and extra time in sports. It's a way of understanding life in a totally new light. And if we can internalize that the study of Torah will change who we are, it'll make us more refined, it'll make us an easier person to get along with, and it'll make our accomplishments so much greater, then I'm sure when we greet God in Shavuot and God gives us the Torah again, it'll be an incredible experience as we take that Torah from God and bring it into our own lives. I hope everyone has a wonderful Shavuot. I know I still have a few more minutes if anyone has any questions, but that is all that I have prepared. Does anyone have any questions, any comments, any thoughts? If anyone's brave enough to unmute themselves, has anyone seen the Mona Lisa of the Galilee? I know no one answered what I asked before. Okay, I guess nobody has ever seen it. Rabbi Friedman, do I have expectations to sit here now until 7 o'clock?
No, you are expected to sit here until 9 o'clock tomorrow night. I forgot to tell you, if you gave a class, then you have to stay through all the rest of okay. No, but I would like you to hang out just for a moment so that, first of all, I can thank the Ritzes again.
Are they on? It doesn't say everyone's names. I don't even know if they're on for me to thank them.
On, but they may have been watching on the live stream because only the Zoomers names are on.
Got it. Okay, well, thank you, Barry and Stacy.
Yeah, Barry and Stacy. And we've been doing, the live streamers have been about at least 2/3 to as many as people as there are on the active Zoom participants. So for example, last night when we had our kickoff class, we had 52 Zoom participants and 27 streaming participants. So they could very well be on the stream. So if they're there, thanks guys. Thank you for your support. Thanks for sponsoring a wonderful class from Rabbi Shapiro. It's really, really good and very thoughtful. Really.
Rabbi, can I say something quickly?
Yeah.
Because I couldn't really answer some of the questions, but I wanted Rabbi Shapiro to know he wasn't talking to fresh air. And I thought it was, because I'm sure that was very disconcerting. And I just wanted to personally thank you. I thought that was an excellent and very interesting presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
It really was. It really, really was. I have to say, Rabbi Shapiro's class has been typical of all the other classes that we've had. All the rabbis have prepared really, really good classes, really A1 classes. And it's all the rabbis that are making this happen. If it wasn't for the rabbis, the presenters, so this would be a non-event, but it really is great. So I want to thank Rabbi Shapiro for coming.